Thanks so much for coming this afternoon. I know how busy New York Climate Week is, and I'm excited about this event, and I'm looking forward to our whole afternoon. I'm Jim Stock. I'm the Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard, and I'm also the director of the Salata Institute, which is hosting this event. Our institute was launched a couple of years ago, and since then we've been focusing on pulling together scholars, faculty, students, alumni, all of the Harvard community to get engaged in more deeply, even more deeply than we already are in the climate and sustainability space. It's a very exciting opportunity to be driving research and to be driving education and to be addressing difficult problems. And today's problem that we'll talk about is certainly among those difficult conversations that we need to have. This panel and all of the panels today are hosted by the Institute's Climate Action Accelerator, and will showcase some of the work the Institute is supporting at Harvard. The panelists are a mix of practitioners and faculty, and they'll share their research, but also their perspectives and ways that we can learn from each other. Harvard plays a vital role in targeting the climate crisis, assuming that we are able to really make a difference through our education and research and teaching. The question of solar geoengineering certainly is a thorny one. It's technically complicated, it's emotionally and politically charged. Navigating it will require deep interdisciplinary expertise. Over the past 2 years since the Salata Institute's launched, we have convened many of these difficult and important conversations, bringing experts and practitioners together and taking an unbiased, clear-eyed look at what's needed to drive real-world, durable climate solutions. We hope that you enjoy today's panels, and we hope that this is just the beginning of your engagement with the Salata Institute and Harvard's climate work. Let me now introduce the panelists and the moderator. Our panelists are Betsy Kolbert, who is the author of Field Notes from Catastrophe, Man, Nature, and Climate, and she's also the author of The Sixth Extinction, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. For her work from The New Yorker, where she's a staff writer, she has received 2 National Magazine Awards and the Blake Dodd Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her book, Under a White Sky, which you can purchase in the back, has been shortlisted for the Wainwright Prize and for writing on global conservation. Holly Jean Buck is an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at the University of Buffalo in Buffalo, New York, and a 2024-25 Harvard-Radcliffe Salata Institute Climate Justice Fellow. Her book, After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair, and Restoration, is also for sale in the back of the room today. It explores best and worst case scenarios for climate intervention. Dan Schrag is the Sturgis Hoops Professor of Geology, Professor of Environmental Science and Engineering, and co-director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program at Harvard. From 2009 to 2017, Dan served on President Obama's Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Dan started his career in paleoclimate and has since branched out to a variety of contemporary climate challenges, including solar geoengineering. So let me welcome you up, and Dan, you will be moderating.
Thanks, Jim. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see everyone here. So I have these 2 extraordinarily accomplished writers. Holly is an academic like me, but she's a lot more prolific when it comes to writing books. And Betsy is sort of the modern John McPhee. She's one of my idols in her role of writing for The New Yorker. So there's so much I want to talk with them about on this topic, but I thought I'd just take a minute to make sure everybody in the room appreciates what it is we're talking about. Solar geoengineering is the idea of reflecting a certain amount of sunlight using a variety of different approaches to compensate for the greenhouse gas increase in our atmosphere from burning fossil fuels. Now, when I first heard about this idea 25 or 30 years ago, and by the way, this is an old idea. There are reports of this in the Johnson administration in the mid-60s when I was born. But the basic idea seemed a little ridiculous. Reflecting sunlight is very different than changing greenhouse gases, which absorb infrared radiation, heat in the end, essentially work all the time, whether the sun is shining or not. But what's remarkable, and I think surprising to many scientists, is how well this actually works. If you actually look at a variety of climate models that have looked at putting reflective particles in the stratosphere, or a variety of other approaches to reflecting sunlight and reducing the incoming solar radiation the Earth receives, it compensates for greenhouse warming, not perfectly, but a lot better than I would have expected. So it doesn't just completely counteract, it's not the magical antidote. But it's a lot better than I think many of us expected. That being said, there are huge challenges to this issue. And when we talk about it, there's kind of a weight in the room, partly because I think it requires us to realize how serious the climate problem is. We wouldn't be talking about solar geoengineering if we thought that decarbonizing and stopping burning fossil fuels was so easy. What many of us believe, though, is that actually this is going to be a long, hard slog, and that climate change is going to get a lot worse. And that is why, as scientists, as social scientists, as scholars, we need to start thinking about this issue, because it's quite possible that world leaders, not us, but world leaders are going to decide they might actually want to use this. So this is going to be an informal conversation. We're going to talk among the three of us, and then I hope we'll be able to bring in the second half, questions from all of you, and we'll keep it relatively informal. I want to start with Holly, because Holly's book explored an interesting aspect of this, the sort of aftermath of how to think about what happens if this ever gets used, and a variety of dimensions. First of all, I'm tempted to ask a question which really is to both of you, which is when David Keith, my former colleague who's now at Chicago, and or I ever talk about solar geoengineering, we really talk about it as distinct from other engineering approaches, also called geoengineering, but things like removing carbon from the atmosphere, or a variety of carbon capture and storage, things that people call geoengineering, but work on very different timescales, very different situations. Solar geoengineering feels different to me. And yet, is it really a part of a spectrum of a whole bunch of different things that you've thought about? I'm curious because not only, Holly, have you written about those other approaches to geoengineering as well, but your book is really not just about solar geoengineering. It's just that the title and the final few chapters are kind of focused on that. Holly, maybe we start with you?
Yeah, this is something that those of us who have worked on geoengineering have talked a lot about. What's the utility of this word? How do we group these different approaches? So I think geoengineering refers to a planetary scale intervention and something that's intentional. So not, burning fossil fuels wasn't intentional to the climate, but it happened. So this is considered a different sort of response because it's deliberate choice. And then you can start to think about mitigation. So in the environmental community, because of some of the legacies of environmental thought, we've thought a lot about mitigation as doing less, being lighter, bicycles, smaller cars, smaller houses. And actually, if we think about what decarbonization entails, it involves a whole lot of stuff. We have to remake these systems. And if you think about the scale of that activity, it will actually be a planetary scale intervention. All of those new supply chains, all of these new products, it's kind of, in some ways, terrifying to think about. And as we get farther towards building out this renewable energy infrastructure, we're hearing more and more about the impacts of that, and people are questioning critical mineral mining and other sorts of, battery supply chain projects. But my point with going in that direction is just to say, it is different, but also maybe if we think about what we're really proposing with mitigation, maybe that's also planetary scale and intentional.
So you're thinking about scale. As a geologist, I think about time scale. And for me, the difference in solar geoengineering is the time. That, if we take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, however we do it, it's going to operate on the time scale of the carbon cycle. We've burned so much fossil fuel that the time scale for the intervention is going to be centuries. That is, the time scale of the climate response to our removing 1 billion or even 5 billion tons of CO2 a year is going to be, if we're lucky, decades, but it's really centuries. Whereas if we started solar geoengineering this afternoon, the Earth would cool this afternoon. It's pretty immediate. You explored a variety of these approaches. I mean, and we talked about this before. When I first read Betsy's book, I thought of John McPhee's book, The Control of Nature, which looks at various engineering interventions at large scale with nature. And I love the title because of the double entendre. It's the, who's controlling whom? Is nature controlling us, or are we controlling nature? But what do you think about that, the time scale and the spatial scale?
Well, I will preface this by saying, as I mentioned before, I'm a journalist. I'm not a scientist, though I sometimes play one on stages like this. But I for that book, I interviewed a lot of people. I interviewed Dan and his dog, who didn't say much. And one of the other people that I interviewed was a colleague of yours, Frank Koich, who was at the time head of the Harvard's solar geoengineering research program, an atmospheric chemist. And I remember one of the things that Frank said to me was, that there are no other arrows in the quiver, basically, that have, the point Dan is making. Anything that we do to try to impact the climate at this point has a very long time lag. There's such a huge amount of inertia in the system. There's a very long time lag. And the only thing that people have come up with, I don't want to say it's the only possible thing, although it would be really interesting to have someone come up with a new one, that people have come up with that could have an immediate impact is solar geoengineering. And that was his big fear, honestly, is that you reach a point, and I'm sure people in this room have read, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future. That begins with an episode of solar geoengineering by India, which has just experienced a terrible heat wave. It's sort of an upbeat version of solar geoengineering. How's that?
That's an upbeat version? Boy,
well,
that's one of the darkest starts to any novel I've ever read.
Well, it's upbeat in the sense that it doesn't...
20 million people die in a heat wave in India, so it's not exactly
that part
uplifting.
Is bad, but the geoengineering part doesn't lead to World War III. How's that? So this notion that we don't have any other measures that we've come up with that could have an immediate impact if things get really, really bad. And once again, I'm paraphrasing Frank, but it is like that. That's what worries me. This is all we have that we've thought of, and that there may come a point when people reach for that. And if they've reached for that and we don't know what we're doing, that's pretty scary. So there are many, different levels of scariness here.
So in the course of this book, you talked to many different people who had a surprisingly large range of feelings and opinions about this. Again, you as a journalist, but you as a listener to these different people who all felt very strongly about this. What did you think about this, the surprising sort of discord among people who all care passionately about climate change?
Well, I think, honestly, as a journalist, of course, we love that. It's a subject that, on the one hand, solar geoengineering is a great topic for journalism, and there's been a fair amount, written about it, because it does make people have a very visceral reaction to it. Even scientists have a very visceral reaction. You're another colleague, I'm sure, Ray Pierre-Humbert, is just absolutely, violently opposed to it. So I've talked to people who feel, really strongly on both sides, and I can see merit on both sides. And the reason it's a bad story journalistically, to be honest, is that it doesn't kind of progress anywhere. So, this same story, as you say, there was geoengineering, was raised. A weird form of geoengineering, throwing reflective balls in the ocean, was raised in 1965 in like the first big federal report that included climate change to President Johnson. And so we keep talking about it, but if, as a journalist, you sort of need, something new to happen, and sort of that has not happened. That newness has not happened. No one has, put anything up into the atmosphere, except for some guys out in California, actually.
Yeah.
Are freelancing.
Last year when I was down in Houston with Jim Stock, and we were at this energy conference called CERAWeek, Cambridge Energy Research Associates Week, with all of the oil industry there. This company was there that is Make Sunsets, that is actively putting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere.
Are they getting to the stratosphere? We don't have any.
I don't think we have any idea. They're putting balloons up there. I have no idea what their actually impact is, and it's a tiny amount. I think they're doing it as a gimmick to say that they're doing it. My reaction to them was, a little bit like the Wagner Group in Africa. There's certain things that just shouldn't be privatized. Military probably shouldn't be privatized the way the Wagner Group was, and solar geoengineering should probably not be a private company for profit. But I don't know if that resonates with you. It just feels all a little bit too ominous. So what do you think about all of this, Holly? I mean, you wrote about this from a perspective. I was reading your papers on the train down from Boston this morning. You've written about solar geoengineering from so many different perspectives. You've thought about from the perspectives of different people, because as a social scientist, you've actually studied what people think about this. Do you think those ideas or those different perspectives, do they come from their different ideological perspectives, or do you think they come from deep understanding of what's going on? So one of the worries I have about our discussion of solar geoengineering is we keep having these discussions with people that have different access to different types of information. And, for example, you mentioned Ray Pierre-Humbert, who was at Chicago for many years, is now at Oxford. He's a wonderful climate scientist, a fabulous meteorologist, atmospheric dynamicist. But he doesn't know anything about energy systems. And so when I say, Ray, okay, you don't like solar geoengineering, what are we going to do? He says, we should decarbonize. I say, of course, we should decarbonize.
I wish I'd thought of that.
I wish I'd thought of it, right. Turns out, if you understand energy systems, you realize decarbonization is a little bit more difficult than just sort of doing it in the next 10 years. And that's why we're here where we are. I'm curious, you've looked at how different people see this issue. Do you think as their experience of climate change evolves, their attitudes about solar geoengineering will evolve too?
Well, I want to make a distinction between publics who haven't heard much about this and people like us in this room that would show up to an event about it. So with the public, what I've found is remarkably consistent initial response from the interviews and focus groups I've done, which is something like, immediately, that doesn't sound like a very great idea. Humans don't have a great track record with interventions. There's probably stuff we haven't thought about. And people have local examples of, what these things are. I was most recently in Oklahoma last month, and they were talking about invasive red cedars as like the thing that is going wrong.
The terrible thing.
Yeah, but everywhere, every region or country has their own example of something that hasn't worked out well. But then people will also say, well, I'm glad somebody's at least looking into this because they recognize that we're not on track with climate action. That doesn't mean they're comfortable with it by any means, and they're not even necessarily comfortable with the different actors who are pursuing it. People respond really strongly negatively to Bill Gates in particular. But that's kind of where, as a very crass generalization, the public is at.
So some of the behavioral scientists at Harvard, people like Max Bazerman or Todd Rogers at the Kennedy School, I've been having conversations with them about this, about the difference between acts of omission versus acts of commission. And in general, people are much less comfortable with acts of commission than acts of omission. There's the classic, train on the track with a switch experiment that is famous. I wonder if that's a big thing with solar geoengineering, because you sort of said, oh, well, climate change is unintentional. It may have been unintentional in the 50s. It's pretty intentional now. It may be inconvenient. It may be very expensive to stop using fossil fuels. But we know that climate change is happening, and I'm still driving my car with gasoline, right? That's intentional. It's just, I'm, decided that I'm not going to change.
Well, I think that, a couple of things there. I do think there's a psychology and an uneasiness and a responsibility that comes with acting in a very, interventionist way. But I also think when people have the counterfactual to geoengineering, they're not necessarily thinking about the counterfactual of 3 degrees of warming or more. They're thinking about the world right now, usually, unless they're really constructing.
What their experience is today.
Yeah, unless they have a vivid imagination of what that 3 degrees world looks like.
Is that consistent with what you found too? That most people aren't thinking about where the world is going, they're thinking about where it is right now? Because as a geologist, that's really troubling.
Well, I honestly am not, I would not claim to have talked to people who are not, deeply invested in geoengineering, about geoengineering. I think probably if we went out, onto 44th Street right now, 99 out of 100 people wouldn't have, they would just have a blank stare, if you ask them about it. But I will just go back to, and a lot of conversations about solar geoengineering do lead back to David Keith. And David, I made exactly this point to David. We are geoengineering, we're geoengineering the climate, just not doing it, intentionally. And he was, at that time, I don't know, sometimes with David you never know where he's going to come out, but at that point he was very adamant that there was something very different, that there was a much higher bar to intentionally doing something. Yes, you could say we are doing it at this point knowingly. I don't think you would say we're doing it intentionally. It's just an unfortunate, side effect of you driving that car. I don't think that you would say, that you, Dan Schrag, want to, contribute to the warming of the planet. It's just, well, I've decided for my own convenience, that I'm going to keep driving this car, and if that happens, so be it. And that has a different, once again, according to David, a very different moral valence from I'm going to go in there and intentionally intervene again. And I think that is one of the great, questions that surrounds solar geoengineering, is this idea that we who are, as Holly pointed out, everyone does, and that's, very much the subject of my book, Under White Sky. We all know of things that have gone terribly wrong. And one of the things that has gone terribly wrong is, that we've screwed up the climate. So are we the people who are, going to intentionally correct that? That's something that people are justifiably somewhat skeptical about.
Yeah. I want to get into who the we are, and because that's the governance question. Joe Aldi is somewhere here in the room, my colleague at the Kennedy School, and Joe has been thinking deeply about the governance of solar geoengineering, which is a really difficult, thorny, hard issue, because who the we matters. But before we do that, I want to just take a little diversion into your other book, because to me there's resonance between the two. Under a White Sky, again, is not just about solar geoengineering, but that is the title, and it is kind of the climax of the book. But the sixth extinction, I love the sixth extinction, by the way.
Thank you.
And the sixth extinction is about biodiversity loss and whether we're experiencing a sixth great extinction like the Permo-Triassic and the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. And I think you would probably agree that we're not yet, but we might get there, especially if climate change gets really out of control. If we see 4 or 6 degrees of warming, it's not clear. If that's the case, if you really care about biodiversity, one of the interesting things on solar geoengineering is that it actually may be the best hope for the natural world.
Yeah, I think that is part of the conversation that definitely deserves a voice. And, unfortunately, as with all of our conversations about, what we're going to do about the world, and this also gets back to what Holly was mentioning before about, clean energy, which has many, many often land use implications and, mucking up new parts of the world to get at new minerals, et cetera, that have huge consequences for other species that are, because they don't speak for themselves, are kind of not at the table. And that is, one of the reasons that we are staring down a sixth extinction. We don't really factor those other millions of other species very often, very seriously into our calculations. Now, if they had a seat at the table, what they would say about geoengineering is an interesting question. I don't know that it would be unmitigatedly, rah-rah, but it's certainly something that I think should be very much part of the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an interesting question about where they stand, and there's been some recent surveys, recent results suggesting that developing countries, poor countries in the world, which some people had suggested would really hate the idea of solar geoengineering, are actually, what they actually care is about reducing their pain, their experience, and maybe more open to the idea than people had thought. Have you been following some of those developments?
Yeah, so there's a few recent papers about this by researchers named Chad Baum, Sean Lowe, Livia Fritz, funded by the European Commission. And they did surveys and focus groups in many different countries, far beyond the normal sample, because up until now there's been just a lot of research in Europe and North America. And they did find that publics in the global south were more supportive, but they don't necessarily know why. So there's the idea that maybe it's because they're experiencing direct impacts from climate change at a more severe level. Also, age structure is probably another factor with a younger population.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's a question of how much people they surveyed actually understand about. I mean, it may be an opinion, but it's not clear it's a very well-informed opinion. So it's not clear how changeable that would be, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can always expect opinions to change as people learn more and as they have conversations with family and friends and trusted messengers rather than just the information presented in a survey.
So what about, though, the fact that in general, and in some ways your career has been a testament to this, this issue is getting more attention now, way more than it did even 15 years ago. In 2007, David, Keith, and I held at the American Academy in Cambridge, right next to Harvard, one of the first big workshops on solar geoengineering. That was 2007. That wasn't that long ago. We had a fabulous group of people attend, and it was a serious discussion, and we had many people who refused to attend because they thought it was too controversial a subject to even talk about. Now there's a Gordon conference that meets every 2 years. There's international conferences on solar geoengineering. We just had a New York Times article about David Keith a few weeks ago. It's getting, there's hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers, and it's become almost mainstream. It's not good funding yet, but it's mainstream.
You know, for years, pretty much every paper I've been asked to review has started with a line that's like, attention on solar geoengineering is increasing. And I would always say, is there empirical support for that? If not, don't begin your paper that way. Mm-hmm. But now I think it's true. And
but there is empirical support,
just
right?
in the past year, I would have let that one by, because there's been a lot of interest from the tech community, which I'm very critical and, I have a lot of issues with, but that's a fact that you can see. Mm-hmm. And now we do have finally some more government funding after years, not in the US necessarily, but in the UK.
You just told me about this announcement. You want to share that?
It's a call from the UK government. I don't remember the pounds, but it works out to about $75 million. So that's a really substantial level of public funding. And I'm really glad to see that, because I think it's very dangerous if private funding is the sole source of funding in this, because we need research that is transparent, that there's public oversight, that there's an open competition for. All of those things are really important to having a robust base for decision makers.
Now, we were at Harvard, everybody should understand, we were fortunate enough to raise a certain amount of money to support solar geoengineering research at Harvard. That's the Solar Geoengineering Research Program. But that's not a solution I mean, in fact, that's in some ways a bad thing. If it's only elite universities that can raise private money for this, that's actually...
Yeah, that's a nightmare scenario.
It's a nightmare
because
scenario,
we're really
exactly.
unprepared for a scenario where there's popular demand for solar geoengineering. You know, people have not thought too much about that scenario because it's so controversial and so unsavory of a topic. It's an undesirable, but there may be in 5 or 15 years, as climate impacts mount, as people get frustrated with climate action unless we can change course on that, people may be demanding solar geoengineering, and then what are we going to do?
Which is not what people in this community are thinking about at all. You know, it's not the
Some
scenario
of them,
that they're
but
thinking.
generally not.
Yeah.
So we're just, it's, I think, frankly, irresponsible of the government not to invest in a better decision-making base.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but wonder if part of the rise in attention, not just from the academic community, but from the public on this issue, is because we're seeing impacts of climate change in a different way. You know, 30 years ago, probably close to 30 years ago, 27 years ago, I was a young faculty member. I just moved to Harvard, and I gave a talk here at the Harvard Club, and there were people, and climate change was something that was going to happen in 2050. And it was going to happen across the world from here. Nobody here was going to experience it maybe till the end of the century. Today, that's not how people feel. Most people have experienced it. Now you've been writing about climate change now for a long time. I remember all your beautiful pieces on Greenland. I loved those in the New Yorker. Have you felt that same change in people's experience of climate change? Or do you think that's partly why this topic has become more prominent?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that when I first started writing about climate change, which is now like sort of almost, which is 20 years ago, you know, I could still go out. I went out with scientists in 2004, so exactly 20 years ago, who were still waiting for, like, you know, the Arctic oscillation. It was going to change, and everything was going to, you know, be different. And a lot of guys, and I'll call them guys, and some of them, most of them probably were men, but not all of them. You know, field scientists. They will tell you, you know, people have written books like Mea Culpa, you know, I don't believe these models, you know, all models are wrong, you know, and then let's just say the Arctic oscillation, you know, didn't alter, it did alter, but it didn't stop this warming trend. And so it was still possible at that point to find even a lot of field scientists, not theoretical physicists, but field scientists who were like, I don't think it's a big
Freeman Dyson aside.
Yeah, good point. You know, now that's completely impossible. Everyone sees it, and a lot of the scientists that I, you know, have talked to over the years are people whose work got basically just engulfed by climate change. Like, I was studying something else, and climate change arrived, and my study subject just, you know, either my glacier or my species, you know, migrated or whatever happened, that climate change just took over on my work. So I definitely think, obviously, climate impacts. I don't need to tell this audience, you know, how much that has changed. But the other thing that I think has also changed, and this was a huge argument, and I guess maybe still is, but is losing a little bit of its force as we watch climate impacts grow, and our actions are so inadequate to mitigating that, or reducing that, or getting to net zero, or whatever you want to say. You know, there's a huge, you know, sort of the moral hazard argument. Well, if you know, dangle this in front of people, that's just going to make people say, oh, well, I don't have to reduce carbon emissions. Well, people are not reducing carbon emissions anyway. I don't think that we would say that's because they're waiting for geoengineering. It's just because, you know, all sorts of political and social and economic factors at work. So I think that another reason you're seeing more and more talk of geoengineering is we see, well, we're not reducing our carbon emissions, you know. So it's not just the climate impacts, it's also that we're not doing what we know we need to be doing.
You know, I'm struck by the analogy to something that is now more mainstream, but even back in 2012, 12 years ago, was not, which is the adaptation to climate change. So for people who aren't familiar with this, for a long time in the US especially, environmental groups, major environmental leaders, including Vice President Gore, were strongly opposed to talking about adaptation to climate change, even mentioning the word. There was some worry that doesn't make any sense today, but I guess back then it made a little more sense, that somehow by talking about adapting to climate change, we were giving in and people were just going to put their effort to that and give up on reducing emissions, actually fixing the problem. And of course, it's absurd. In 2012, here in New York City, after Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, or hit New Jersey and flooded the lower Manhattan, I was working for President Obama, and he, after he was reelected in early November, he asked us to make some recommendations of how he could emphasize climate change in his second term. And we led with that we had to focus on national preparedness for climate change. We just had an incredible heat wave that summer and drought that devastated the Corn Belt. And then we had Hurricane Sandy. We had more than $150 billion of climate-related damages that year. And yet that statement that we should focus on preparedness for climate change was met with hostility from the environmental community 12 years ago. I don't think that's true anymore. And certainly you can listen to Al Gore talking about how important climate adaptation is around the world. But I kind of wonder if we're in the same situation with solar geoengineering, if part of the problem is that people don't want to hear about it because it means like we're giving up somehow. Do you think that's possible?
I do think there's an interesting, analogy there. I mean, I think that there are profound differences, too. So I don't want to say it's a direct analogy because, obviously, preparedness is a very, distributed thing that we have to do. And geoengineering, I think one of the, we haven't gotten to the many scary aspects of geoengineering, but one of them is that it has to be a unified thing that, someone or some entity is doing. It can't be like willy-nilly geoengineering, even though those guys at Make Sensets are, doing their own version of that. But to really do it with any impact and, is a huge undertaking over many, over generations.
Well, that's certainly an important thing that everybody should understand, that once you start doing solar geoengineering, and actually Frank Koich, whom you mentioned, my colleague who's an atmospheric chemist, Frank, and I don't know if he invented this analogy, but he certainly is the person I heard it first from. He used the analogy that solar geoengineering is a little bit like morphine. That is, if you had major heart surgery, doing it without anesthesia would be unthinkable. But if you only take the morphine and don't actually have the heart surgery, that actually is a problem too. And so solar geoengineering is not a fix, it's the anesthetic. It keeps us from experiencing some of the impacts, but it doesn't fix the underlying problem, which gets worse and worse. And it's addictive, and it's got this long time scale because you have to keep doing it. Otherwise, you get a big shock.
Right, and I think one very profound question, and Holly has that sort of famous graph in her book, so buy her book, where you're sort of shaving the top off the worst of climate change via solar geoengineering while you're radically reducing your emissions and also doing a big chunk of carbon dioxide removal. This is sort of famous, back of the napkin. I've forgotten the guy's name. Who did it? That graph?
Maybe Shepard.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. Anyway, it's everywhere now. But if we're not doing those other two things, and we're not, then the question is, should we even have this conversation? Should it even be broached? So if you say, well, we need to be doing those two other things, otherwise solar geoengineering makes no sense, and you're not doing those two other things, well then maybe we should just put this aside until we are doing those two things.
And yet, I've got to say, I mean, there's a research group that's supported by the Salata Institute that I'm part of, focused on adaptation in South Asia. This May, temperature records in Delhi were shattered when they had a heat wave of 52.3 degrees Celsius. 52.3 degrees. That's like what is it, 128 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that? Crazy. Crazy. Off the charts. And you think that's 2024? What's going to happen in 2050 or 2070? Suddenly, the Ministry for the Future scenario of this heat wave that kills 20 million people doesn't look like science fiction anymore. And in that situation, not to mention, I mean, this could be true all over the world, to deprive the world of that fix almost seems like a bigger moral hazard in terms of letting suffering happen at the scale that it could happen. I mean, to me, that heat wave this past May is a wake-up call for really what could happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think look, I
mean, to say, well, we have to be investing in reducing emissions at the same time. Yes, absolutely, I believe that, but you still can't let people die.
Well, the great thing about being a journalist is you don't have to decide. And one of the quotes that you gave me, Dan, is we don't get to decide anyway. I mean, scientists don't get to decide. Certainly, journalists don't get to decide. The political system, to the extent that a decision, quote unquote, will be made, and that's another scary thing potentially about geoengineering. But I will give a shout out to Andy Parker, who's in the room and who gave me what is really actually my favorite quote in Under a White Sky, which is, we live in a world where dimming the fucking sun may be less dangerous than not doing it. And, that is potentially true. And that's another very scary thought.
But we don't really want to know that. Like, that's the problem, right? We don't want to really acknowledge that.
Can I add maybe 3 things to this moral hazard conversation? One, I want to acknowledge that I hear from a lot of colleagues in the Global South that they hate the idea that people like us are up on stages talking about doing this on their behalf without including them more in the conversation. Mm-hmm. So just to hold that there. 2, I think that people in the future, I can easily imagine them being mad that we didn't do more to thoroughly research this idea when we had some time, some research capacity. But also this mitigation deterrence, that's what we call it in circles I work in. I do think people should be thinking more about adaptation deterrence. I think people may end up thinking about SRM as a form of adaptation, and that presents maybe possibilities and issues.
But I think it absolutely is a form of adaptation. There's no question. We've argued about this over the years, but not you and I, but David Keith and I used to argue about what this was.
But if we want to get really crisp about mitigation deterrence, I think we should think about phase-out deterrence specifically, so phase-out of fossil fuels. And is this napkin diagram for buying time to decarbonize really saying, oh, we're going to buy time for certain producer nations to produce more fossil fuels? And that seems to me to be the most likely implementation. I'm not saying that's good. I have huge issues with that, but I think we should look at it from that lens, from ending fossil fuels as a goal, and then what does this do? How does it interact with that? Mm-hmm. Do certain actors profit from this for,
Yeah, there's so many dimensions of that are worth following. I do want to maybe get some thoughts from the audience. I think there's many people here who have some interesting questions for any of us or short comments. It would be better if you had a question ending in a question mark. And let's start. We have some microphones here, so why don't we start over here in the second row? If you could just say your name and then ask your question.
Hi, my name's Danielle. I have 1,000 questions. I'll limit it to a longer form one, but I'm so interested in this point you're just making, Holly, on and the point you made earlier about why didn't we do this sooner? Well, just when you kind of pull the thread on a lot of the things you've talked about, I'd love to hear you talk more about the kind of political implications of how, kind of thinking through these scenarios. Let's say you get to a situation in the U.S. where the U.S. public is upset about global geoengineering. Why are we not doing solar geoengineering? And in the global South, if you can talk, you can just, I guess my question is, you can see how this so quickly descends into anarchy, and it's so difficult to have a governing body that cohesively pulls the different stakeholders together to get a plan in place. So when you look at that diagram and you think about all the different stakeholders at, public-private partnerships required, maybe can you talk us through a little bit about how you envision the governing structure required to make these decisions, and also like how you anticipate the blowback? Like what, when you kind of think through the scenarios, maybe just talk us through, kind of governance and potentials for anarchy.
Yeah. I mean, there's people in this room who could speak to this even better than I could, so I'll just share a couple of thoughts and concerns. I do think when I've done interviews with experts, pretty much everybody expects there to be a UN-type process involved. People can't really imagine it outside of that. I do think we could be in a situation where you do see private actors taking the lead and the global governance system following. I think that we can look at how dependent some communities are on Starlink, for example, and SpaceX and the stranded astronauts and whatever. You can see where that might lead. But I also think national politics are really important, and I just want to be sure we're considering the implications of there may be an agency leader, a cabinet member in the White House that believes in chemtrails, that the idea that geoengineering is already going on, and there's spraying happening, because RFK has made many statements about this. And
right,
so
it goes right along with vaccine denial, right? It's the anti-vax extension.
Yeah, and that
you
has
were saying
global implications.
It's not even chemtrails anymore, right? It's that directly solar geoengineering, not a byproduct of chemtrails, but it's actually that there's a community of people that think the government is secretly engineering the climate. What was it? To make climate change, to hide climate change from us so we wouldn't
freak out, basically.
So we wouldn't freak out, I see.
Yeah, this has changed over the past few years.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. One of the great things about this community is that I happen to know Joe Aldi is in the room, and I'm just going to ask if we could give a microphone to Joe for just 30 seconds and see his response to the question of governance, because he's been working on this a lot. And let's get him a mic. Joe, you want to stand up?
Sure. Thank you, Dan. So I first encourage us to be a little bit more open-minded about what governance could look like. We functionally don't have governance now, and a lot of the discussions I think that say, what if we have a kind of UN type of governance, is perhaps reflecting what we might want to happen or what we might think should happen when we think about engaging, all the countries of the world and the representatives in the kind of UN kind of process. It's not clear how we get from where we are today, how we get there given current institutions and power politics where we are today, to that. There hasn't been a lot of appetite within our current framework for how we negotiate on climate, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to bring these issues into that discussion. There have been some efforts, modest, to try to bring this in the context of the UN Environment Assembly. It may be just as likely that it starts off being a series of conversations among major powers. It may be something where you start to see, I think, a discussion among some countries that have capacity to do this, and perhaps other countries that are on the sort of the front line of climate change that see, for them, climate change over the next several decades may truly be existential in terms of the risk it poses. So I think it's important for us when we think about the governance here. Right now, we don't have a system of governance. It's not even clear what might be the system of governance under national law here in the United States. And so I think there's value here in how we think about how we might talk and discuss this. But in a sense, I feel like sort of muddling through in a somewhat anarchic process may be more likely than how we might think about, say, a negotiating mandate to create a system that 190 countries would agree on.
Yeah, it seems much more likely, Joe, that it would be that a superpower, say the US, or could imagine China, builds a coalition which has some international legitimacy. It's, imagine the first Gulf War, where we built a coalition, whether it was legitimate or not, to expel Iraq from Kuwait. We went in and did it with a coalition of countries that included enough Middle Eastern countries that there was some sense of legitimacy. Was it really legitimate? That's a whole different question. You could imagine something analogous, some combination of, that may be terrifying to some people, but it feels like that's more plausible than having a UN process where every country gets a vote in how this gets operated on.
I feel like maybe Janos has a comment.
I was going to suggest Janos too, because I saw his hand.
Let's give Janos a chance, especially on this topic.
So, Janos Pastor, my name, and I actually wanted to raise something else, but I have to come into this. I agree with you, Joe. I think we're going to muddle up. We live in a very imperfect world, and there will not be any perfect solutions forthcoming, especially the way the world looks these days. So, but one interesting thing, and I agree with the panel, that in the last few years there has clearly been an increase in activity and knowledge about these issues. There's more scientific stuff happening, more media coverage, and yes, there is bubbling up activities, including privately funded, publicly funded, all kinds of things are happening. I think that will more likely push governance elements by governments than trying to get together 194 countries in the UN for now. But the one thing I wanted to mention is that maybe we're focusing too much on the technology here. And that's why, the reason governments are not that interested, because there has not been any serious societal conversation about this. There have been bits and pieces, different organizations, but there has not been anywhere real serious societal conversation. And it seems to me that, Dan, you used the word, Al Gore's film, right? The Inconvenient Truth. We have an Inconvenient Truth 2.0 today, which is that our leaders in government, in civil society, are not talking about the very serious situation we're going into, the extreme heat and the impacts of that. And instead of talking about geoengineering or stratospheric aerosol, all these weird things, we need to start serious conversations about what is coming and then look at the options. And there are some options. There are not too many options, but there are some options. And that's where I think we need to have focus, and then that eventually will lead to pushing governments and others to do the governance that they need to do at some point.
Thank you, Janos. I think it's a very well-articulated point. An extension of that is the question of, in this country especially, but it's true in Europe as well, that support for climate and action on climate is dominated by the progressive left, even more so in this country. And I'm curious, because of that, do you think that this discussion of solar geoengineering, in some ways, the discussion of governance or discussion of any of these issues with solar geoengineering, suffers from a kind of political ideological bias? Because the only people who really care about it, when you have, a big part of the electorate denying that climate change exists, it's hard to have a broad discussion of solar geoengineering and its context. And it's actually ironic, in my experience, early on, 2007, 8, 9, when we were just doing some early work on solar geoengineering, relatively early work, it was a weird set of bedfellows who would come to workshops on this. It was people who were very concerned about climate change and didn't think we could decarbonize quickly enough. I guess I would fall into that. And then there were climate deniers who liked the idea of a technological fix, because it showed all those tree huggers were wrong and that climate wasn't a big deal and we could just fix it with putting stuff in the stratosphere. And that's a very strange group of people to put in the same room, but that's who was attracted to this topic. So I'm curious, in your experience, you wrote this book that you talked to lots of people. I bet most of them were progressive.
Well, I'm not sure if that's, when I talk to, the book covers a lot of different interventions in nature and a lot of, interventions to counter previous interventions, and a lot of them were just, engineers. We're gonna re-engineer the Mississippi River because, New Orleans is sinking and we got to do something about that. So I'm not sure that I would say that there was a political, cast to the cast of characters that I interviewed. Now, when you get to, talking about solar and geoengineering, I think you're making a good point, Dan, which is like, if you don't think climate change exists, well, the idea of a desperate measure to, counter this thing that doesn't exist, that doesn't seem to really make sense. So you do have this sort of lopsided, conversation within a conversation. And I think that, Janish's point, which I think is very well taken, but the idea that we could have an intelligent conversation about anything these days, to be perfectly frank, seems very utopian. We can't seem to, agree on the fact that climate change is occurring. So if you can't have that conversation, and I think that should unfortunately be the backdrop to all of our conversations, is that we can't have intelligent conversations. So is there an intelligent way to act in the absence of intelligent political conversations? That's maybe like a koan or something, just like a huge paradox. But that's the paradox that we live in.
I mean, we are having this event here, which is the beginning of a public conversation.
Yes, but that's a very, very...
New York Climate Week doesn't count, huh?
No, I don't think so. Sorry, guys. Yeah.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, over here. Let's get the microphone right there.
Michael Lynn, it seems obvious from this discussion that we have a pretty good idea what is actually going to happen here, because we're going to have the research. It's going to be forced on us because we can't act. Government is not going to act, and when it does, it'll be a laggard. Private industry is going to move forward in the pattern that it's always moved forward in. We understand how the fossil fuel and petrochemicals industry are acting today. They're acting out of their personal self-interest, not in a social self-interest. So the real question to me is it possible to get regulatory control over this before it gets executed? And if so, how?
You want to take that? Anybody? You want to start, and then I can add? What do you think?
I mean, so what I was hoping when I wrote that book, which was published already in 2019, was that there would be a social movement that would engage with this seriously and make demands around regulation and how to do research and what all of that looks like. And so that's who I was writing to. I was writing to a progressive climate left. But that didn't happen. So I'm kind of feeling in the same boat as the question asker here. It seems like we know what direction things are going. I do want to make a shout out that there are people in this room actually working on creating deliberative conversations, like Shuchi Talati from the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. So there's pockets of people, but we need really a broad movement to engage with this, and I don't see it in the near term.
Yeah. In terms of regulation, I mean, I think those discussions are happening, but I think regulating something that is so hypothetical, I think that specific conversation is a little premature. But maybe not. It certainly feels, though, that I'm not even sure what the right body to regulate it would be, given the global nature of what we're talking about. So that's a very difficult conversation, and one that needs to happen more and more. Yeah.
I think the only, consoling, if it counts as consolation, is, it's not that easy to have a fleet of airplanes, delivering whatever it is that we decide. Now, once again, we haven't even talked about that. We don't know what it is exactly that we're talking about. But something delivering, constantly some kind of reflective material to the stratosphere, even ExxonMobil, presumably can't do that on its own. They're very powerful. I don't want to doubt that at all. But if someone doesn't want that, if some government with an air force doesn't want that, it's not that easy for ExxonMobil to just go and do it.
Yeah, that's right. It's probably too big for that. And so the idea that some rogue billionaire could do this, I think that's not actually feasible. Moreover, I suspect that the U.S. and a variety of other governments that are powerful, have powerful enough militaries, would shut that down. In fact, I suspect if a rogue country did this, even like the Ministry for the Future scenario where India does it but does it badly because they're so desperate, my guess is the U.S. would immediately stop them and do it better or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, to Joe's point, obviously, if you had all, a group of the powerful nations of the world, those who control the airspace, you could do it. And if you don't have that, presumably you can't do it unless someone comes up with a very, very clever way of doing it.
But I'll just tell you, with this is going on, I was approached by a high school friend of mine from here in New York City just this year who wanted me to participate in some new foundation effort that's focused on doing this from space.
From space.
From space, right. So people have long suggested putting mirrors up in space, and this particular group thinks that the way to do it is to launch it from the moon. So you have to make these mirrors on the moon and then launch it. So this is decades away,
on the moon,
and wanted me to sort of be involved in these discussions. It wasn't something I was going to put a lot of time into right now. But the fact that people are thinking that way as a more permanent, long-term solution that you don't have to renew every year, that...
Yeah, well, I think this gets also to a point that Holly made. I can't remember if she made it in the back room or here, but I think is also part of this trickling up, as it were, of the conversation, which is that I think there is a big interest in the tech world for a tech solution. And that there'll be a fair amount of tech money, and you see this in not just in solar geoengineering, but in a lot of techie, carbon dioxide removals ideas that, quite possibly don't have any real merit, but that there will be a lot of money going towards that kind of thing because it's what is the tech industry like? Tech. And, so I think that is part of what's happening, is that more and more people in the tech world are interested in this sort of thing.
Well, and it's interesting because the other aspect of geoengineering that has also received a lot of tech money is carbon dioxide removal, right? And ironically, David Keith created a company that
made a lot of
sold
money,
for $1 billion that is focused on carbon dioxide removal. They haven't removed any serious carbon yet, but he made a ton of money when they sold it to an oil company.
Makes you think.
Yeah, it makes you think. In fact, I have a good friend in this room who is also now running a company. He's an academic who's running a company focused on carbon dioxide removal. All the right motivations, trying to actually fix the world. But we don't really want this for solar geoengineering. It feels different, right? This Making Sunsets group seems really problematic.
Well, they are. I mean, I don't want to. I actually was going to go out and watch them launch a balloon, and I never did. But I mean, they're almost like the Keystone Cops version of this. It's kind of just funny, honestly, on some level. But I think that even carbon dioxide removal and the flood of money going toward that says something about where we're placing our bets and what is the next quote big thing. And I feel like a lot of those investments, and I'm not here to give investment advice, but they're not going to pay off, as it were, but they seem like the next big thing. And I think that's kind of disturbing when we know that there are a lot of there's still a lot of quote low-hanging fruit that needs a lot of money going into it, that we're pouring a lot of money into technologies. And there's a lot of money in the Inflation Reduction Act. We were talking about this before, for technologies that probably are not really worth it. So, we're just going to waste a lot of money. And I don't think that is smart, but that's what's going to happen.
You know what? I have no problem with wasting a certain amount of money. This, we're spending this year about $2 trillion on clean energy investment, about $1 trillion on fossil investment. If we waste 20, 50, $100 billion a year on all sorts of things that, I think that's just the nature of this problem. We're going to have to waste some money. We're going to have to break some eggs, see what works and see what doesn't, and we'll make some mistakes. Let's get some other questions on the table. Here in the back and then up here in the front. Oh, I was going to go there, but that's fine. We'll do you first. You first. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Mike, and I want to go to Holly. Thinking about this question around governance, I think there's a closely connected piece around trust. This is a unique problem that's global, that, you think we just had a pandemic, and we created a vaccine to defeat this novel virus, and look at where we are now. We live in a time where it's hard to imagine both policymakers and especially the public having trust in the research and what we've learned about the potential risks and possibilities in terms of solar engineering, solar geoengineering. So I'm curious how you think about trust, and maybe Dan, how does Harvard think about its research and creating it in a way that it could be trusted by both policymakers and the public?
Yeah, so I think that actually scientists, in the data that we see, they receive more trust than other actors, for better or worse, even with all the challenges. I think that obviously early meaningful public engagement in the research process is really important. So talking with people as you're formulating the questions, as you're building teams. I think international cooperation is going to be really important. The National Science Foundation put out a letter of, what do you want to see with regards to carbon removal and solar geoengineering research. I really hope that if the US government decides to fund more research in this area, they will fund international teams. I think that'll be so important. Those are the two first ideas that come to mind.
So let me just be very clear. One of the things I've learned from being at Harvard now, this is my 28th year teaching at Harvard, is that I don't speak for Harvard. Harvard is a big, cacophonous group of very interesting, smart people, and there's lots of people who disagree with each other. But I do happen to chair this group called the Solar Geoengineering Research Program. It's a group run by a group of faculty who, and our intention is to use the money we've raised to support the most interesting and important work in this subject. And my own personal view, and I've said this publicly many times, is that I would love to see as much money being spent on people who focus on what could go wrong as how to do it. I think it's absolutely now we have to ground truth it and figure out all the ways that it could fail before some world leader somewhere actually starts to implement it and deploy it. And now's the time to do that work. Our limitation right now is that it's hard to drum up interest. So we're doing lots of workshops internally at Harvard to try to get serious scholars interested in this subject to propose serious research projects. And that's a slow but very important, deliberate process. I personally am attracted to where solar geoengineering doesn't work very well. A graduate student of mine a few years ago did her PhD in this area, working on the way plants grow and especially how they transpire water into the atmosphere. It turns out there's a really interesting effect. If you increase CO2 in the atmosphere, you would warm the climate, but then you add solar geoengineering, you cool it back down. Imagine you do that so that they too compensate. But now the world has higher carbon dioxide concentrations, but the same temperature. Turns out trees respond to that physiologically. My colleague Missy Holbrook is a plant physiologist. She would tell you what they do is they close their stomata because they're right now limited by taking up CO2. With more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they can close their stomata and be much more water efficient. And so they evaporate less water. So instead of compensating in a place like a tropical rainforest, it would actually change the hydrologic cycle and through an effect that nobody's thinking about. And you can explore these effects. They're interesting scientific questions of how, you think you're compensating one thing for another, but technically when you look at the details, it doesn't actually work that way. And now's the time to figure that out. Now's the time to explore that. Because, what if this is not going to be a byproduct of solar geoengineering, but what if by accident you dried out the rainforests? That would be really bad. Now that's not going to happen, but it's the kind of questions we need to ask now before we talk about engineering the launch program. Anyway, let's get some of the other questions. There was one over here. And then there was one back there and then one over here. Yeah, go ahead. It's okay.
Okay.
We have time.
I'm Nishad. I'm based from Doha in Qatar. So we are not exactly into solar geoengineering, but we do a lot of cloud seeding in Abu Dhabi and UAE. I don't think this comes as a desperate message because we have no choice because of water scarcity. And also, like you mentioned, extreme heat in India. I think Middle East would be inhabitable before India if the temperature rise goes at this rate.
I think you're
like
probably
Kuwait,
right,
Iraq,
unfortunately.
etc.
Yep.
So, do we have a choice? I mean, like mitigation is not working at all. We've been in the climate space for long enough to know that the countries are committed, but commitments are not letting to reach us. Forget 2 degrees Celsius, it's hitting 4. So, do you think this sort of leadership would come from the region like Middle East, especially UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc.? Because you were talking about like some countries has to take a bolder step, and do you think this sort of bolder steps from the region comes out of desperate? Because maybe in the US it's not, because you have a lot of legal system, House, Parliament, Senate, etc. But unlike in our region, it would be a decision to make from the science body reporting to the higher officials, and it get approved. So do you think our region should not go ahead because of all the ethical sides, but obviously keeping all that in mind, to make sure people can live in our region, we have no choice to go to geoengineering, cloud seeding, etc. So how do you see your perspective from a Middle East perspective?
So I want to turn to Holly for a sec, because she wrote something about conflict and peace and solar geoengineering, which I really liked reading this morning, and I think there's a connection here. But let me quickly take a stab at this. There's an undergraduate senior this year who is about to start his senior thesis and working with me, and the topic is going to be the geopolitics of solar geoengineering. The idea of this really is that, you know, the discussion of governance of solar geoengineering immediately gets to all sorts of complicated clash of ideologies. Before we get there, I actually think it's important to map out what the geopolitics are. That is, who are the winners and losers, and what are the interests before you even get everybody in a room to talk about governance. Maybe figure out who wants what. The Middle East is pretty easy for 2 reasons, right? I mean, essentially, there's a lot of issues, but there are essentially 2 questions. One is, how close to the edge of viability are you because of climate change? And as you said, the Middle East can't take too many more degrees of warming. It's pretty close to the edge now. And number 2, Middle East produces a lot of oil, and if there is any extra incentive for making the problem better while we continue to use oil, that probably, and if there is an effect on sustaining oil production and the oil demand, and slowing down the energy transmission, which is of course a bad thing for the climate, but certainly the Middle East countries are self-interested in that way. So it's a win-win for them, or win-win-win. Russia, for example, very different situation. They are a big oil and gas producer, but they have other reasons why solar geoengineering is a problem. They've invested hundreds of billions of dollars in the north of Russia and Siberia for natural gas export and LNG export and oil export, those ports that are now open because of climate change in the Arctic. And I don't know a way to, for example, stop the Greenland ice sheet from melting over the next several decades, centuries, with solar geoengineering, and not also freeze those ports in Russia. The way the stratosphere works, east to west, it's very uniform, and so you can't just cool Greenland and not cool the Arctic around Russia too. Maybe somebody will figure out a way to do that, but I don't know of any way. So to me, Russia's complicated because they may decide that solar geoengineering is bad for them. We need to look at that in more detail, but I think the other issue with the Middle East is, the other choice is migration. You could leave. Of course, that's not very attractive to countries in the Middle East. It's not attractive to countries in South Asia either, which is why I thought about what Holly was writing about conflict and whether solar geoengineering will produce more conflict or more peace. You want to say something about that?
Just briefly, there was a lot of literature that examined how geoengineering could cause conflict or war. And I thought, well, why aren't we also thinking if it could be a means of cooperation or peace building or negotiation between different countries that have different interests in this climate crisis, in the phase out timelines? I don't know. I wanted to raise it. But I do know we need more dialogue between perspectives like yours and some of our domestic interests here in the US.
Yeah.
We need to hear each other's ideas.
And I think, by the way, that's true about solar geoengineering. It's true about climate change in general and the energy transition in general. Ricardo Hausman, my colleague at the Kennedy School, he and I have been teaching an executive education course to people from all over the world for 2 years now on we call green growth, which is the idea that the energy transition is actually a growth opportunity for many poor countries in the world. That, these are places with a lot of sun and wind and water and biomass, as well as some critical minerals, cobalt in the DRC, for example. And therefore, the energy transition may actually be an economic boon for them. And that changes, I kind of wonder if we can actually solve the climate problem without having somewhat of an economic convergence of the poor and the rich countries in the world. I'm not sure we can solve a global problem without fixing some of the economic disparities, but that's a maybe topic for another day. We had a question in the back. Somebody who was very patient. Sorry, the person who had originally raised his hand there, and then the woman in the red, but before that, the woman here in the black. So let's start back there first. Yeah. Can we bring the mic back to her? Thank you.
I'm Tanya. I'm from India, and especially I was in New Delhi when you mentioned 52 degrees. I was standing there and feeling it on my head. Wow. And I've been part of the climate energy sector in India with the government, and we had talks about solar engineering. But the question here is, we as a developing country cannot introduce it because it will impact our climate as well. It'll change the monsoon season, especially in the ocean area. So the project is still at halt. There's a lot of investment involved. So would you still, it seems like good for US to pursue this, but for countries like us, it might not be a preference, even though we are suffering from all of this. So what would you like to say about the negative impacts of solar geoengineering, since the structure is still not very regulated?
So this is exactly where the research is needed. We need to understand how solar geoengineering would affect the monsoons in India. We need to understand how it affects El Nino in the tropical Pacific. Some of that work has happened, but frankly, one of the things that it needs is collaborative work, and our group in South Asia is working very closely with SEWA and with a number of other groups, collaborators at universities in India on these topics. And solar geoengineering needs that same broad collaboration. Let's get a few more topics because we have only about a few minutes left. So I want to make sure people get their questions on the table, and I'll give Betsy and Holly a chance to finish that off. Let's move here to the woman in black here.
Thank you. My name is Cynthia. I work with the Climate Justice Alliance. Going back to something that's been referred to, and I've seen very little literature on this, that it has to be kept up in perpetuity once this starts. And I have read about that there would be a blowback, a termination shock if we were to stop using geoengineering, and I mean solar geoengineering, and I'm wondering if we could hear a little bit more about what people think that means, because doing something in perpetuity over generations seems pretty hard to imagine.
Yeah, well, I think before we address the termination shock, I think you understand what they mean by perpetuity, because I'm a geologist, I think on really long time scales, so in perpetuity is like a long time from my perspective. What they actually mean is the time scale of the carbon cycle to gradually remove all of the CO2. There's a wonderful book on this that I assigned to my class at Harvard, which is written by David Archer, my friend at the University of Chicago, who's a brilliant carbon cycle scientist. And David wrote a book called The Long Thaw. And it's a wonderful broad book on climate change. I recommend it highly. It's only about 130 pages. It's a little paperback, and it's a fabulous book. And what he describes is how 10, 20, maybe 25% of the CO2 that we put in the air is going to still be there tens of thousands of years from now. And it's going to slowly come out because of the chemical reaction between rocks and water and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so the time scale of the climate problem is really long, 100,000 years, maybe longer. That's the scale of the impact we're likely to have. Now, if we were to solar geoengineer and do nothing else to the carbon cycle, no other type of engineering, then we'd have to keep doing it, because if we started solar geoengineering and kept burning fossil fuels, CO2 levels would go higher and higher and higher, and we'd add more and more solar geoengineering, and we get addicted to it. If you ever stop, boom, the temperatures would rise really fast. That's what we mean by termination shock. That's, by the way, why I think the approaches to solar geoengineering are much better with timescales in the stratosphere of a year or two, because you don't want to do something that you have to renew every week or two. But that assumes you don't mess with the carbon cycle. And frankly, there are a lot of people, including friends in this room, who are engineering ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere. If you do that, you can shorten the timescale. And that's what you've written about a little bit, right?
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that the first chapter of my book explores this termination shock scenario. And once we had the infrastructure to design and fly aircraft in the stratosphere, the incentive to keep that going would be pretty strong. So something like a war could disrupt it permanently, maybe if it was a really catastrophic war, but then you have other problems going on in the world as well. So a lot of political scientists think that this is something we should pay attention to, but it's not necessarily a likely scenario.
Yeah. I want to give Betsy the last word overall today, but I do, before we end, because Jim is standing there because I think there's food in the back and we have to have some food before the next panel. I should also say that when we said at the very beginning of this panel that the difference between solar geoengineering and all the other types of geoengineering was timescale, I think I said that, and that solar geoengineering is the only thing that can act on short timescales. There is one other thing, and that is short-lived greenhouse gases. And the next panel is going to be Daniel Jacob and Carrie Jenks, my colleagues, who are going to talk about methane. And methane is not super short time scale as fast as solar geoengineering. It's not hours to days, but it's years to a decade or two, and it can have a big impact right away. And that's, I think, a pitch for the next panel. So please stay for that. Betsy, you've listened to all of this. You get the last word overall.
Wow, I don't deserve the last word. I think I would just say this is an issue that, interestingly enough, as we talked about, was raised right away. It was raised by very smart people. We're clearly not going to stop burning fossil fuels, so we're going to have to geoengineer the climate. And no matter what happens, I think it's not going away. Even, unfortunately, if we discover that there are all these bad side effects. I certainly agree with Dan that we need to know about them, but I'm not sure that we're ever going to abandon this, conversation. Are we ever going to actually solar geoengineer? I have absolutely no idea.
So thanks everybody. Jim, I'll let you wrap up.
Thank you so much, Holly and Betsy. That was just a terrific conversation. It's clear there's, of course, lots of research that needs to be done, but I think, echoing both what you just closed with, Betsy, and also the Holly comments you made, the importance of actually having serious conversations about this topic, really exploring the ramifications, engaging broadly in those conversations beyond our normal spheres, I think is incredibly important, and it's something we need to be doing expeditiously given the challenges and the threats ahead. So thank you very much, and thank you, Dan, for moderating, and I hope you have an opportunity to talk with him afterwards.